So you are currently living in a hallucination.
Well, that's a pretty intense way to start things off.
I mean, think about it, though. When you look at a map of the world, you see these 195 neatly colored puzzle pieces,
Yeah.
right? The countries.
Right, the standard map we all stared at in geography class.
Exactly. You see these hard lines separating France from Germany or, Brazil from Argentina. And we completely take for granted that the world is just naturally divided into these sovereign entities.
Oh, absolutely. We just assume it's the natural baseline of human existence.
Right. But what if I told you that this map, the very way we organize human existence, is actually a completely artificial, relatively recent European invention?
And not a peaceful one either.
No, not at all. It was violently forced onto the rest of the planet. And worse, what if this 400-year-old operating system is the exact reason we are struggling so immensely to solve the existential, borderless crises of our time? From climate change to global poverty.
It is a really profound realization to have. I mean, once you understand that the system was built by people, you start to see all the structural flaws in the architecture.
And that is exactly what we are going to dismantle today. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are looking at a massive stack of sources that basically serve as a comprehensive academic primer on the foundations of international relations.
Which is such an important topic.
It is, because the mission today is to help you look past the chaotic daily news cycle. I mean, when you turn on the news, it just looks like a random series of disconnected emergencies, right?
Yeah, just leaders arguing, wars breaking out, trade deals collapsing. It feels like chaos.
Total chaos.
Yeah.
But we are going to decode the invisible machinery of global politics that's actually driving those events.
And it is incredibly complex machinery, but there is a distinct logic to it. We're going to explore the hidden rules of international law, the high-wire act of nuclear diplomacy, the complex web of global economics.
The really fun stuff.
Right, and how this system attempts, and let's be honest, often fails to handle threats that cross those imaginary borders.
So, whether you are trying to understand the roots of a modern conflict, or you're analyzing international markets for your business, or you are just insanely curious about how 195 heavily armed independent nations manage not to completely destroy each other on a daily basis, this deep dive is for you.
It's the ultimate operating system for understanding the globe.
Exactly. So let's start at the very beginning. Let's unpack the hallucination. How did we actually get to this map? Because the sources point out it wasn't always this way.
No, not at all.
So what did the geopolitical landscape actually look like before we had countries as we understand them today?
Well, to understand the modern system, we really have to look at the medieval European system that preceded it, because the modern state is a direct reaction to that specific environment.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So medieval Europe was essentially this chaotic, overlapping web of loyalties. There was absolutely no concept of a sovereign state with exclusive control over a defined territory.
Wait, how does that actually work in practice? Like, if I'm a peasant living in, say, 14th century Europe, who is actually in charge of me?
That's the perfect question, because the answer is, well, many different people. And they are all claiming different types of authority over you at the exact same time.
Sounds incredibly confusing.
It was. Let's look at the local level first. Political and economic power was intensely localized. You had feudal lords ruling their specific estates, collecting taxes and administering local justice.
Right, the guy in the castle on the hill.
Exactly. But you also had independent city-states, particularly in regions like modern-day Italy or Germany, which were run by merchant guilds and had their own distinct legal codes. And then you had various peasant communities that operated with a degree of self-governance simply because they were just too remote for a lord to constantly monitor.
Okay, so it's hyper-local. I pay my taxes to the guy down the road.
Yes, but overlaid on top of all that hyperlocal power were two massive universal institutions that claimed authority over absolutely everyone.
Which were?
The Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church, centered in Rome.
Which creates a total jurisdictional nightmare. Like, if I commit a crime or if I owe money, do I answer to the local lord, the emperor, or the pope?
It was a constant tug of war. The church, in particular, wasn't just a spiritual guide. I mean, it was a deeply entrenched political and economic superpower.
Right, they had real worldly power.
Huge amounts of it. The church owned vast amounts of land across the entire continent. It extracted its own taxes, known as tithes. Crucially, the church controlled the legal system in many respects, and it had a complete monopoly on the Latin language.
Which was the universal language of learning, law, and diplomacy at the time.
Exactly. Because literacy was essentially confined to the clergy, the church penetrated every single layer of political structure. A local king couldn't even run his own court without relying on church-educated administrators.
Oh, wow. So you can't even process your own local laws without the Pope's guys doing the paperwork.
Right. This created a system where universal authority constantly undermined local authority. A king might want to go to war, but if the Pope threatened to excommunicate him,
Which essentially means damning his soul to hell.
yes, and crucially, releasing his subjects from their loyalty to him. If that happened, the king's power just evaporated overnight.
So this is a deeply entrenched, highly complex web. How do you go from that interwoven mess to the hard borders we have today? Like, what actually broke the web?
The web was shattered by two massive intertwined catalysts. First, the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century, and second, the Protestant Reformation in the early 16th century.
Okay, I understand the Reformation splitting the church, but how exactly does a printing press change geopolitics? That feels like a stretch.
Well, the printing press democratized information. It completely destroyed the church's monopoly on Latin. Suddenly, books and pamphlets were being printed in the vernacular, the local languages that people actually spoke, like German, French, or English.
Oh, I see. So people are reading for themselves.
Yes. And this began to forge shared cultural understandings among people living in the same regions. It created an audience for ideas outside of the church's control.
Which perfectly sets the stage for someone like Martin Luther.
Precisely. When Martin Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in 1517, protesting the corruption of the Catholic Church, the printing press allowed his ideas to just go viral across Europe in a matter of weeks.
The 16th century version of going viral.
Literally, the
Right.
Reformation split the spiritual authority of Europe. You had new Protestant denominations forming that absolutely refused to take orders from the Pope.
And I imagine the local kings and princes looked at this theological dispute and saw a massive geopolitical loophole.
Oh, they definitely did.
Like, if I suddenly declare my territory Protestant, I no longer have to pay taxes to Rome, I don't have to listen to the Pope, and I can confiscate all of the incredibly wealthy church lands within my borders to fund my own army.
It was the ultimate political opportunity. Monarchs like Henry VIII in England or Gustav Vasa in Sweden utilized this religious fracturing to consolidate their own central power, finally shaking off that universal authority of Rome.
But as you can imagine, the universal powers did not just let go without a fight.
No, they did not. This fracturing led to over a century of horrific, overlapping conflicts across Europe. It all culminated in the devastating 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648.
Yeah, the numbers our sources provide on the 30 Years' War are absolutely staggering. It wiped out roughly a third of the population in the German states.
It's hard to even comprehend that scale of loss.
I really need to pause on that because how do you achieve that level of mass casualty in the 1600s? I mean, they didn't have carpet bombing or nuclear weapons. How does a war with muskets and pikes kill a third of a population?
The sheer devastation was a result of the mechanisms of warfare at the time. The armies fighting the 30 Years' War were largely composed of mercenaries. These weren't professional, state-funded standing armies with disciplined supply lines. These were massive bands of armed men who were often unpaid by the monarchs who hired them. So to survive, they resorted to the wolf strategy.
The wolf strain.
Yeah, they fed themselves by completely pillaging the countryside.
So they're just moving from town to town like a swarm of heavily armed locusts, stealing all the grain, burning the fields, and slaughtering anyone who resists.
Exactly. And when you completely destroy the agricultural base of a region, starvation immediately follows. And trailing right behind the starvation and the marching armies came devastating outbreaks of disease, including the bubonic plague.
Just a total nightmare.
It was an apocalyptic breakdown of society. The conflict began as a religious war, Protestant princes versus the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor, but it evolved into a brutal, protracted struggle over the very nature of political power in Europe. It was a fight to determine which state, if any, would dominate the continent.
And after 30 years of unimaginable slaughter, no single dominant power emerged. Everyone was essentially bled dry.
Right, complete exhaustion.
Which brings us to the peace settlement, the year 1648, and the treaties collectively known as the Peace of Westphalia. This is practically written in bold, glowing letters in every international relations textbook, right?
It is the big bang of the modern international system. The Treaty of Westphalia symbolizes the birth of the sovereign state. To stop the endless bloodshed over religion and universal authority, the exhausted powers of Europe agreed on a new set of rules. From this point forward, the highest political authority would be the state itself.
Okay, so what does that actually mean in practice? How did Westphalia change the rules of the game?
It established the principle of exclusive territorial jurisdiction. Essentially, the ruler of a state has absolute authority within their own borders, and no external power, not a pope, not an emperor, and not another king, has the right to interfere in the domestic affairs of that state.
So if a prince wanted his territory to be Protestant, it was Protestant.
Yes, if you wanted it Catholic, it was Catholic.
Basically, your house, your rules.
Precisely. Your house, your rules. Furthermore, Westphalia established the concept of formal legal equality among states. In this new system, it didn't matter if you were the massive Kingdom of France or a tiny independent principality in Germany. Under international law, you were legally equal sovereign entities. You both possess the same ultimate right to rule your own territory.
But this introduces a term from the sources that we really need to clarify, because the terminology is incredibly counterintuitive.
Okay, which term?
The sources state that the Westphalian system created a condition of anarchy. Now, when an everyday person hears the word anarchy, they picture masked rioters, smashing storefront windows, cars on fire, total societal collapse. Yeah. But that is not what political scientists mean when they say the international system is anarchic, is it?
Not at all. In the study of international relations, anarchy is a structural term. It simply means the absence of a supreme authority.
Okay.
It means there is a decentralized system with no overarching global ruler, no world government, and no international police force.
So within a country, anarchy means a breakdown of law and order because the government has failed. But between countries, anarchy is just the default setting. Nobody is in charge of the whole system.
Exactly. Because all states are sovereign, there is no higher authority they have to answer to. This creates a deeply paranoid environment.
Why paranoid?
Well, because there is no global 911 you can call if another country decides to invade you. Every single state is ultimately responsible for its own survival.
Which means you constantly have to look over your shoulder, you have to build up your own military, or you have to forge alliances to balance out the power of your neighbors.
And that paranoia drove the evolution of the state itself. To survive in an anarchic system, early modern states had to become highly efficient machines for making war. To make war, they needed massive armies. To pay for massive armies, they needed sophisticated bureaucracies capable of extracting wealth from their populations through taxation. The modern state apparatus, tax collectors, census bureaus, administrative ministries, all of that was largely born out of the desperate need to fund survival in an anarchic world.
Okay, so Westphalia gives us the cold, bureaucratic machinery of the state. You know, the borders, the tax collectors, the military. But the map today isn't just a map of states. We call them nation states.
We do.
So how does the nation get plugged into the state? Because those aren't the same thing, right?
They are very different concepts, and their fusion didn't happen until much later, primarily sparked by the French Revolution in 1789.
Okay, walk us through that.
Before the late 18th century, the state was essentially the private property of the monarch. King Louis XIV famously declared, "L'État, c'est moi, I am the state." The people living within the borders were merely subjects. They had absolutely no political ownership of the country.
They just worked the land and paid the taxes.
Right. But the French Revolution violently overthrew that monarchical system. The revolutionaries declared that sovereignty did not reside in the body of a king, it resided in the nation. And a nation is a community of people who share a common identity, a shared history, culture, or language.
So the French Revolution basically takes the cold administrative shell of the Westphalian state and injects it with the emotional unifying soul of a nation.
That is a perfect synthesis, and the combination of the two, the nation-state, unleashed a level of power that Europe had never seen before.
In what way?
Well, during the subsequent Napoleonic Wars, the French government instituted the levée en masse, which was a mass conscription of citizens, because the people now felt they were the nation, they were fighting for their own survival and their own identity, not just dying for a king's personal glory.
That's a huge psychological shift.
Massive. The French army swept across Europe, fueled by this explosive new force of nationalism.
And once that genie is out of the bottle, you can't put it back. I mean, the people of the countries, France invaded the Germans, the Italians, the Spanish. They started to develop their own national consciousness in response.
Exactly. They started demanding the right to self-determination, the right of a nation to govern itself within its own sovereign state. The concept of the nation-state became the dominant political model in Europe throughout the 19th century.
Okay, I follow the European history.
Yeah.
But this brings up a massive question about the rest of the world. Our map today shows 195 sovereign nation-states spanning every continent. How did this highly specific European invention, born out of the 30 Years' War and the French Revolution, become the universal operating system for the entire planet?
Mm.
Did everyone else just look at Europe and say, wow, great idea, let's copy that?
If we connect this to the broader historical reality, the answer is incredibly dark. The Westphalian system wasn't adopted voluntarily by the rest of the world. It was violently exported through European colonization. Beginning in the 15th century, and really accelerating through the 19th century, European states projected their power outward. They conquered the Americas, established massive mercantile empires in Asia, and notoriously scrambled to partition almost the entirety of the African continent among themselves.
They exported their power, but they certainly weren't exporting sovereignty. I mean, the very definition of being a colony is that you are denied sovereignty. Your territory is ruled from a capital thousands of miles away, and your resources are extracted for someone else's benefit.
That is the great contradiction of the colonial era. European states violently enforced sovereign equality amongst themselves in Europe, while simultaneously denying it to the rest of the globe.
Just total hypocrisy.
Yes. They decimated indigenous political structures, erased ancient borders, and drew arbitrary lines on maps that completely ignored the cultural, ethnic, or linguistic realities of the people actually living there.
And this leads to the ultimate irony of decolonization in the 20th century. When these colonized peoples finally fought for and demanded their independence, particularly after the exhaustion of World War II, what did they have to do to get it?
Well, to be recognized as legitimate, independent actors by the international community, they had to adopt the exact European model of the nation-state that had oppressed them.
Wow.
They had to organize themselves into neatly defined territories with fortified borders, central governments, national flags, and foreign ministries.
So there was no other way.
No. Whether there were alternative, non-European ways of organizing a society's relationship to land and power, perhaps through more fluid, overlapping, or nomadic structures, that was never permitted as a valid option. To sit at the table at the United Nations, you had to look and act like a European nation-state.
So our entire modern mindset, the fundamental architecture we use to view global problems, is completely locked into this single paradigm. We view every crisis through the lens of 195 fiercely competing sovereign entities.
And that structural reality makes solving shared global problems incredibly difficult. Because by design, every single one of those 195 states is structurally incentivized to prioritize its own national interest and its own survival above the collective good of humanity.
Which is a terrifying thought when you realize we're all sharing the same planet. Let's explore how we survive that. If the system is truly anarchic, if everyone is heavily armed, fiercely independent, and there's absolutely no world police to stop them from taking what they want, how are we not constantly fighting World War III?
It does seem like a miracle sometimes.
I always picture international relations as an incredibly high-stakes neighborhood association meeting where everyone hates each other and everyone is holding a loaded shotgun under the table.
It's a vivid analogy, and in a purely anarchic system, constant war seems like the logical outcome. But the sources highlight that while war grabs the headlines, diplomacy is actually the normal state of affairs.
But how does diplomacy actually function? It's not just leaders having polite tea and asking nicely, right? How does the neighborhood keep the peace?
It works through highly structured, formalized communication. Diplomacy is essentially the mechanism that allows rival states to pursue their objectives, gather intelligence, and resolve disputes without having to resort to the unimaginable cost of physical warfare.
Where did that structure come from?
The roots of this structured system actually predate the Westphalian state. It emerged during the Renaissance among the independent city-states of northern Italy.
Okay, places like Venice, Florence, Milan. These were incredibly wealthy, deeply competitive hubs of trade.
Exactly. And because they were so geographically close and economically intertwined, they realized that living in a state of constant unpredictable warfare was terrible for business.
Right. Dead customers don't buy things.
Exactly. The disruption to trade routes was destroying their wealth. So, to bring some predictability to their rivalries, they began dispatching permanent ambassadors to reside in each other's courts.
Oh, so instead of sending a messenger on horseback only when you want to declare war or beg for peace, you have a guy permanently living in your rival city, constantly taking the temperature of the room.
Precisely. This continuous presence allowed them to gather vital information, negotiate complex trade deals slowly over time, and most importantly, diffuse misunderstandings before they escalated into violence.
Makes sense.
And to make the system work, they had to invent rules. They established the concept of diplomatic immunity, the understanding that even if your city goes to war with my city, you cannot arrest or execute my ambassador.
Right, because the moment you kill the messenger, the entire system of communication collapses and everyone is just flying blind.
Exactly. They also established that diplomatic pouches and correspondence were inviolable. These Italian innovations formed the bedrock of the diplomatic protocols that eventually spread across Europe and ultimately the globe.
So diplomacy is essentially the grease in the gears of anarchy. It keeps the friction from sparking a massive fire. But what happens when the stakes are so high that diplomacy seems impossible? Let's talk about the Cold War.
Ah, yes, the United States and the Soviet Union.
Our sources go deep into this, and they introduce this chilling strategic concept of deterrence. Because deterrence isn't about peace, it's about the threat of absolute annihilation.
Deterrence fundamentally altered the nature of global politics. For all of human history, weapons were built to be used on the battlefield to defeat an enemy. But the advent of nuclear weapons changed the calculus.
How so?
Deterrence is the strategy of holding civilization-ending weapons solely to ensure that the other side will never dare to attack you. It is the ultimate defensive posture achieved through the threat of ultimate offensive destruction.
The analogy that always comes to mind is two people standing in a small room that is flooded knee-deep with gasoline. Both of them are holding a matchbook. You don't light your match, even though you despise the other person, because you know the resulting explosion will incinerate you too.
Mutually assured destruction. MA.
It is a terrifyingly accurate acronym.
It really is. During the Cold War, the U.S. and the USSR were locked in a fierce ideological and geopolitical rivalry. But they couldn't fight a direct traditional war because both sides possessed vast nuclear arsenals. If the Soviets launched a preemptive strike, the U.S. had enough weapons dispersed on submarines and in silos to survive the initial blow and guarantee the complete destruction of the Soviet Union in retaliation.
But deterrence relies entirely on human psychology. It requires the people holding the matches to act perfectly rationally 100% of the time and never let emotion, miscalculation, or a faulty radar reading cause them to drop the match.
Yes.
And in October of 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, someone almost dropped the match.
Yeah.
How did diplomacy prevent the gasoline from igniting?
The Cuban Missile Crisis is arguably the closest humanity has ever come to intentional nuclear annihilation. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev decided to secretly deploy nuclear ballistic missiles to Cuba, which is just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Right, in America's backyard.
He did this partly to counter the presence of U.S. missiles in Europe, and partly because Fidel Castro requested them to deter the U.S. from launching another invasion of Cuba following the disastrous Bay of Pigs operation the year prior.
So the U.S. discovers these missiles via spy planes. And the public posturing from both sides was incredibly aggressive.
It was terrifying for the public.
President Kennedy goes on television and institutes a naval blockade, which they called a quarantine, to avoid the legal definition of an act of war and demands the removal of the missiles. The Soviet ships are steaming toward the blockade line. It feels like the end of the world. So how do you negotiate when backing down publicly looks like total surrender?
That is the genius of the diplomacy that took place. Kennedy and Khrushchev realized that if they relied solely on public ultimatums, neither could back down without losing face domestically and internationally, which would inevitably lead to war.
So they went behind closed doors.
Yes, they bypassed the public posturing. They utilized secret back-channel diplomacy to find a compromise that addressed the core security insecurities of both nations.
What was the actual deal that was struck in the shadows?
The Soviets agreed to publicly dismantle and remove their missiles from Cuba under verification by the United Nations. In exchange, the U.S. made a public pledge never to invade Cuba. But the crucial piece of the puzzle was a secret agreement. The U.S. quietly promised to remove its own aging Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy, which had been a major source of anxiety for the Soviets.
It's fascinating because they didn't have an epiphany and suddenly become friends. Kennedy and Khrushchev still viewed each other as existential threats.
And this is a fundamental lesson about what diplomacy actually is. Effective diplomacy is rarely about forging magical, sudden trust between sworn enemies. It is about cold, hard realism.
Right.
It is the arduous process of establishing verifiable frameworks where competing self-interests happen to align for a moment, usually for the sake of mutual survival. Because they couldn't rely on trust, the agreement hinged on verifiable actions, the physical removal of the missiles.
And the terror of that close call actually catalyzed further diplomacy. It led to the creation of the direct hotline telephone link between the White House and the Kremlin to prevent future miscommunications.
Yes, and it paved the way for the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty.
Okay, so Cuba was a crisis handled in a matter of intense days by two leaders communicating directly. But what happens when the standoff lasts for decades and the two countries literally refuse to even acknowledge each other's legitimacy?
That requires a different approach entirely.
I'm looking at the sources breakdown of the Iran nuclear negotiations, which ran from 2003 to 2015. The U.S. and Iran had decades of toxic bad blood, going back to the 1979 hostage crisis. They did not speak. How do you even get them in the same room to start the process?
When direct communication is completely severed, it requires a third party, often a non-state actor or a coalition of less polarized states, to step in and build a bridge. In the case of Iran's nuclear program, the breakthrough is actually initiated by the European Union. Yes. In 2003, three major EU nations, the UK, France, and Germany, known as the EU3, took the initiative to open high-level diplomatic talks with Tehran.
I want to focus on that mechanism because the U.S. was actively hostile to this at first. The Bush administration had just labeled Iran part of the axis of evil. That is a massive risk for the EU. They essentially stepped directly in the path of the world's sole superpower, their own military ally, to force a peaceful mediation. Why would Europe risk angering the U.S. over this?
Because of the immediate historical context. In 2003, the U.S. had just invaded Iraq, which neighbors Iran. The invasion was highly controversial, and there was absolutely no appetite in European capitals for another destabilizing, catastrophic war in the Middle East.
They wanted to head off another war.
Exactly. The EU believed that engaging Iran diplomatically was the only way to prevent an inevitable military confrontation down the line. Their intervention managed to engage Iran just enough to stall the most dangerous aspects of its nuclear program and keep the diplomatic door wedged open.
And eventually, the reality of the situation forces the U.S. to the table.
Yes. By 2006, the U.S. was deeply bogged down in counterinsurgency wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The political and military capital required to launch strikes against Iran's fortified, deeply buried nuclear facilities was simply not there.
It just wasn't viable.
Right. The U.S. administration recognized that a military solution was off the table. So the U.S. joined the talks, expanding the group to the P5+1, that's the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany.
And what follows is almost a decade of grueling, highly technical, intensely frustrating negotiations. We're talking about arguing over the exact percentages of uranium enrichment and the precise number of centrifuges Iran is allowed to keep spinning. But the sources highlight a deeply human element to this process that I think often gets lost in the geopolitical analysis.
It is easy to view states as monolithic, robotic actors, but diplomacy is ultimately conducted by human beings sitting across a table from one another. The text details how the lead U.S. negotiator, Wendy Sherman, and her Iranian counterpart, Abbas Araki, actually bonded on a human level. During the years of negotiations, both of them became grandparents, and despite representing nations that considered each other bitter adversaries, they took moments to share videos of their new grandchildren with one another.
That is such a profound detail, because showing your rival a video of your grandchild doesn't magically erase the fact that Iran sponsors militant groups or that the U.S. imposes crushing economic sanctions. But it grounds the interaction.
It builds a foundation of human empathy and personal resolve. Negotiating a highly complex, politically explosive agreement requires immense stamina. Those personal connections give diplomats the endurance to keep returning to the table when the talks inevitably hit a wall. The sources mention another powerful anecdote from the final day of negotiations in Vienna in 2015. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry spoke to the room about his experience going to war in Vietnam as a 21-year-old. He described the horror of combat and told the gathered diplomats that he had made a lifelong commitment to do whatever was in his power to ensure war was the absolute last resort.
That must have been intense.
It was. The room fell silent, and then the entire room, including the Iranian delegation, applauded.
It gives me chills.
Th-
But again, to connect this to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the final 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal was not built on Kerry and the Iranians suddenly trusting each other. It was a physics problem.
Exactly. It was a triumph of verifiable mechanics. Iran agreed to drastically reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium, dismantle thousands of centrifuges, and subject its facilities to the most intrusive, rigorous system of international inspections ever implemented by the International Atomic Energy Agency.
And what did they get in return?
In exchange, the U.S. and the international community agreed to lift crippling economic sanctions.
So the entire goal was simply to stretch out the breakout time. The time it would take Iran to produce enough fissile material for one bomb from a matter of weeks to over a year. So if they tried to cheat, the world would have 12 months to detect it and stop them. It was a mechanical substitute for trust.
That's a great way to phrase it.
But this reliance on treaties and complex legal agreements brings us to a massive logical hurdle. And I want to push back on this whole concept. We established earlier that the international system is anarchic. There is no world government. There is no global police force with a shiny badge and handcuffs who can arrest a country.
Correct.
So if a state just decides to rip up a treaty and ignore the rules, who stops them? How can you possibly claim that international law exists if there is no one to enforce it?
It is the defining paradox of international law, and it operates on a fundamentally different mechanism than the domestic law you and I are used to. To explain why it works, the sources offer a brilliant analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a small pioneer settlement where a few families live on separate, distinct homesteads. There is no town council to pass ordinances, there is no judge to settle disputes, and there is no police force to arrest anyone.
Right, sounds like the Wild West. If I want your land, I just take my gun and push you off it.
You might think so, and initially violence might occur. But very quickly, even in that lawless settlement, customs and rules naturally emerge. The families start to respect the physical property lines between the farms. If the head of one family makes a deal to trade cattle with another family and then that head of the family dies, the new head of the household honors the old deal.
Why? Because living in a state of perpetual, exhausting paranoia, sleeping with one eye open every single night because your neighbor might burn your barn down, is a terrible way to live.
Exactly. It is highly inefficient and dangerous. The community realizes that their mutual survival depends on predictability. A core principle emerges organically. Agreements must be kept. In international law, this foundational concept is known as pacta sunt servanda.
Pacta sunt servanda.
Yes. International law exists primarily because states recognize that the international system is simply smoother, safer, and more economically prosperous when there are predictable rules of the road that everyone generally follows.
Okay, so customary law emerges out of necessity. But how do we decide what the actual rules are? For a long time, the rule was basically you only have to follow the rules you explicitly agree to.
Correct. Historically, the entire foundation of international law was state consent. Because states are sovereign, no law could be imposed on them against their will. This was famously articulated in 1927 in the Lotus case by the Permanent Court of International Justice.
What did they rule?
The court ruled that states are only bound by the rules and treaties that they have explicitly consented to sign. If you didn't sign the treaty banning a certain weapon, you aren't breaking the law if you use it.
But the sources indicate that this framework has evolved. We don't just rely on signatures anymore.
Right. The system has matured significantly, especially in the wake of the atrocities of the Second World War. The international community realized that state consent cannot be an absolute shield for horrific behavior. We now recognize a concept called jus cogens, which translates to compelling law.
Just cogens.
Yes, these are peremptory norms of general international law that are accepted by the international community as a whole, and they permit absolutely no exceptions or derogation.
Wait, peremptory norms. Let me translate that academic jargon for the listener.
Yeah.
You are essentially saying that there are now universal cheat codes in international law.
Exactly.
Rules that are so fundamental to human decency, like do not commit genocide, or do not enslave people, or do not practice piracy, that a dictator cannot simply wave a piece of paper and say, well, I never signed the anti-genocide treaty, so it is perfectly legal for me to exterminate this minority group. The global community now says, we do not care if you signed it or not. The rule applies to you simply because you exist on this planet.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. Just cogence norms bind every state, regardless of consent, and the institution that is central to the development and administration of modern international law is, of course, the United Nations.
The UN, founded in 1945, literally built on the ashes of World War II. Its stated purpose is to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Let's break down the mechanics of the UN because it's not a world government, but it acts like the central hub of global diplomacy. How does power actually function within the UN?
The UN is structured to balance two competing realities: the legal equality of all states and the harsh political reality of global power dynamics. It achieves this through its two main bodies. First, you have the General Assembly. This is the egalitarian wing. Every single recognized member state, from a superpower like China to a tiny island nation like Tuvalu, gets one seat and one vote.
It's the ultimate global town hall.
Yes, it is.
But the catch is that the General Assembly's resolutions are generally non-binding. They carry immense moral and political weight, but they can't force a country to do anything. The actual teeth of the UN reside in the Security Council.
Correct. The UN Security Council is the executive committee. It has the unprecedented legal authority under international law to pass binding resolutions. It can impose crushing economic sanctions on a rogue state. It can mandate arms embargoes, and in extreme cases, it can authorize the use of international military force to restore peace.
But the Security Council is the exact opposite of egalitarian.
It is highly exclusionary. It consists of 15 members. 10 of those seats rotate among the general membership, but the remaining 5 seats are permanent. They are held by the P5, China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And most importantly, each of these 5 nations holds an absolute veto power.
I really want to push back on this because it feels like a massive flaw in the system.
Yeah.
You have an organization dedicated to global equality and peace, but you give 5 countries a magical kill switch.
Right.
If 14 out of the 15 countries on the Security Council vote to intervene to stop a genocide, but one of the P5 members say, Russia or the U.S. decides they don't want to because the dictator is their ally, they raise their hand, use the veto, and the entire resolution dies instantly. That is fundamentally oligarchic. How is that a functioning system?
You are absolutely right that it is undemocratic and oligarchic, but we have to look at the historical mechanism objectively. The veto was not an accident. It was a cold, calculated, necessary political concession.
Explain that.
When the architects were designing the UN after World War II, they looked at the failure of its predecessor, the League of Nations. The League failed largely because major powers like the United States never joined, and others like Germany and Japan simply walked out when the rules constrained them.
Because if an international organization threatens the core vital interests of a superpower, the superpower will simply ignore the organization, rendering it useless.
Precisely. The founders of the UN knew that if they did not give the world's heaviest hitters, the nations that actually possess the military might, to enforce global security, a guaranteed mechanism to protect their absolute core national interests, those nations would never join the UN in the first place. The veto is the price the world pays to keep the most heavily armed nations sitting at the negotiating table instead of destroying the table entirely. It is a mechanism of realism overriding idealism.
Okay, I understand the brutal logic of it.
Yes.
But if the Security Council is fundamentally designed to be gridlocked whenever the major powers disagree, which during the Cold War was basically every day, how did anything actually get enforced? Did someone just step into the vacuum to act as the enforcer?
Oh, yes.
This brings us to a heavily debated concept in the sources. The role of the United States acting as a global security manager, a period often referred to as Pax Americana. We need to examine this impartially because it generates immense friction globally.
To understand the U.S. role, we have to look at the immediate aftermath of World War II. Europe and Asia were in ruins. The U.S. emerged as the only major industrial power with its economy intact and a monopoly, temporarily, on nuclear weapons. American policymakers looked at the causes of the war and concluded that isolationism was a failure. They decided that to protect American security and prosperity, the U.S. had to actively manage the global system.
And they didn't just build a massive military, they built the economic architecture of the modern world. Can you explain Bretton Woods? Because it's a term thrown around in economics but rarely explained.
Sure. Bretton Woods was a conference held in 1944 in New Hampshire, where the Allied nations essentially agreed to peg the global economic system to the U.S. dollar, which was in turn pegged to gold. It established the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank.
What was the goal?
The mechanism was designed to prevent the catastrophic currency devaluations and protectionist trade wars that had exacerbated the Great Depression and led to World War II. The U.S. used its vast wealth to underwrite this system, providing the liquidity needed to rebuild global trade.
So the U.S. builds the economic system, and it simultaneously builds a massive security apparatus. It forms NATO in Europe to counter the Soviets, it builds a globe-spanning network of military bases, and its Navy essentially acts as the guarantor of open shipping lanes worldwide. But acting as the global police force isn't cheap, and it isn't an act of pure charity.
Far from it. The text discusses the staggering financial and political costs to the U.S., trillions of dollars expended, and tens of thousands of American lives lost in prolonged interventions ranging from Vietnam to the modern conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Furthermore, this posture breeds massive structural resentment globally.
Why? Because nobody likes the police when they pull you over.
Yeah. More profoundly than that. Many nations, particularly in the global south, the Middle East, and among competing powers like Russia and China, view American military interventions and economic sanctions as a form of neo-imperialism.
Right.
They argue the U.S. is selectively enforcing international law, invading sovereign nations, or toppling governments when it suits American geopolitical or corporate interests, all under the guise of maintaining global security.
And there's intense resentment within the United States as well regarding what the sources call the free rider problem.
Yes, the domestic blowback is significant. The economic argument is that because the U.S. taxpayer funds this massive global security umbrella, wealthy allied nations like Germany or Japan are able to artificially suppress their own defense budget.
Because they know the U.S. will cover them.
Exactly. Because they know the U.S. military will protect them, they can divert their wealth into building robust domestic infrastructure and expansive social safety nets for their citizens. They are effectively free riding on American military hegemony. It creates a deeply complex, highly volatile dynamic that is currently under immense strain.
We connect this back to how international institutions function. The sources make a crucial distinction that helps clarify this. The UN, NATO, the IMF, these are all what we call intergovernmental organizations, or IGOs.
Yeah.
In an IGO, the ultimate power always remains with the sovereign state.
Correct.
A state can choose to ignore a UN resolution or withdraw from a treaty if it wants to. But there's a rarer, much more intense type of organization, the supranational organization. What is the mechanism of a supranational body?
The distinction is vital. In an intergovernmental organization, states cooperate, but they do not surrender their sovereignty. A supranational organization, however, actually requires its member states to legally pool and transfer a portion of their sovereign authority to the organization itself.
That sounds intense.
It is. The organization gains the power to make laws that are directly binding on the member states, even if a specific state votes against the law.
And the ultimate example of this is the European Union.
The EU is the most advanced supranational project in history. The member states have surrendered their individual power over trade policy, agricultural standards, and environmental regulations to the institutions in Brussels. Furthermore, most of them surrendered the ultimate symbol of state sovereignty, the power to print their own money. They abandoned their national currencies to adopt the euro, managed by the European Central Bank.
Which is an incredible achievement for a continent that spent centuries tearing itself apart in wars. But, as we've seen with events like Brexit, when citizens feel that unelected bureaucrats in a supranational organization are dictating laws that harm their local communities, the backlash is fierce. They demand their sovereignty back. Which transitions us perfectly. We spent this entire time talking about elites, presidents, diplomats, military generals, and supranational bureaucrats. What about the rest of us? The mechanics of this system feel completely detached from the everyday person. How do normal citizens actually influence this massive, invisible machinery?
They influence it profoundly, particularly through the global political economy. To understand the mechanics of this, the sources introduce a foundational economic theory by the thinker Karl Polanyi. He developed a concept called the double movement.
The double movement. I want to dive deep into this because it feels incredibly relevant today. What is the mechanism of this movement?
Polanyi analyzed the expansion of free market capitalism. The first part of the movement is the aggressive expansion of liberal economic policies, deregulation, free trade, the privatization of public goods. The theory argues that markets are inherently ruthless. They view human labor and nature simply as commodities to be bought and sold efficiently. When these free market forces are unleashed globally, they cause immense social dislocation. Factories close, traditional industries are wiped out by cheaper imports, and communities are devastated.
That's the first movement, the market expanding.
Correct. But humans are not passive commodities. The second part of the movement, the counter-movement, is society's inevitable organic reaction to the pain and disruption caused by the unfettered market. Social groups, labor unions, and everyday citizens rise up and demand that the state intervene to protect them.
So they push back.
Yes. They demand tariffs to protect local jobs, minimum wage laws, environmental regulations, and social safety nets. Polanyi argued that modern history is a constant, violent pendulum swing between the expansion of market freedom and the societal demand for protection.
But wait, I want to push back on that. If the pendulum naturally swings back to protect society, why hasn't it swung back to protect the industrial workers in the American Rust Belt, or the farmers in developing nations being crushed by global agribusiness? It feels like in the era of hyperglobalization, the market just keeps expanding and the counter-movement is failing.
That is exactly the crisis of the modern era, and the sources explain why the counter-movement is struggling. It is because the nature of the state itself has fundamentally changed. Modern states have transformed into what political economists call competition states.
What does that mean?
In the past, a state's primary economic goal was to protect its domestic industries and provide full employment for its citizens. But in a hyper-globalized world where capital can instantly cross borders with a keystroke, the state's primary goal has shifted. The state now actively restructures its own domestic laws, slashes its corporate tax rates, and dismantles its environmental and labor regulations for one desperate purpose:
Which is?
to make itself highly attractive to foreign direct investment from massive multinational corporations.
I see. It's a race to the bottom. A country says to a massive corporation like Apple or Nike, don't build your factory in the country next door. Come here. We will offer you 0% corporate tax for 10 years, and we guarantee our labor laws are so weak that your workers won't be able to unionize.
Exactly. The state becomes an agent of the market rather than a protector of the citizen. And when state abandons its role as the protector who fills the void, that is where civil society and international non-governmental organizations, NGOs, step into the breach.
NGOs, we hear that acronym a lot. We're talking about groups like Amnesty International, Greenpeace, Doctors Without Borders. How do these organizations, which have no military and no legal authority, actually force sovereign states to change their behavior? Give me a historical mechanism.
A powerful historical example is the origin of the Red Cross. In 1859, a Swiss businessman named Henry Dunant happened to travel near the town of Solferino in Italy just after a massive battle between French and Austrian forces. He was horrified by what he saw. Nearly 40,000 soldiers were left dead, dying, or bleeding on the battlefield, and the military had almost no medical corps to treat them.
The states literally just abandoned their own citizens in the mud once they were no longer useful for fighting.
Exactly. Dunant didn't have any political authority. He was just a civilian. But he organized the local villagers, especially the women, to provide impartial care to the wounded of both sides. He then wrote a book about the horror, which shocked the conscience of European elites.
Wow.
He used that momentum to found the International Committee of the Red Cross and relentlessly lobbied governments. His individual activism directly led to the drafting of the First Geneva Convention in 1864, which established binding international law protecting wounded soldiers and medical personnel.
That is one guy witnessing a horror, utilizing networks, and literally writing a new universal rule into the geopolitical code. And NGOs continue this work today.
They absolutely do.
The sources mentioned the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which successfully organized global protests to force wealthy nations to forgive the crushing debt of the world's poorest countries, or the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty, where a coalition of civil society groups managed to push through a global ban on anti-personnel landmines, completely bypassing the reluctance of the major military powers who wanted to keep using them.
It's proof that organized citizens can override state power.
But the sources highlight a very specific, fascinating tactical mechanism that modern activists use. It's called boomerang activism.
I love this concept. How does the physics of a boomerang apply to human rights?
It is a brilliant strategy used by marginalized groups when they are blocked, ignored, or actively oppressed by their own domestic government. Normally, if you have a grievance, you petition your local government, but what if your government is a dictatorship or is deeply corrupt and in bed with the corporations exploiting you? If you protest locally, you just get arrested, or worse, the domestic route is blocked.
Exactly. Since they cannot achieve justice domestically, they throw their plea outward like a boomerang. They bypass their own state and link up with transnational activist networks, NGOs, and sympathetic foreign governments. The sources detail a harrowing and highly illustrative case study from Cambodia in 2006.
Let's dive deep into the mechanics of this Cambodia case, because it perfectly illustrates how global economics interact with local suffering. What happened?
The Cambodian government enacted a policy granting massive 10,000-hectare land concessions to private, politically connected companies to create vast sugar plantations. The goal was to harvest the sugar and export it to the lucrative European Union market under a special free trade initiative designed to help developing nations. The problem was, everyday Cambodian farming families were already living and surviving on that land.
But didn't they have deeds to their farms? Couldn't they just go to a local court?
They couldn't because of the tragic historical legacy. During the genocidal reign of the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s, the regime abolished private property and systematically destroyed all land registry records. So when the government granted these new concessions, the farmers had no legal paper trail to prove ownership.
Oh, it's devastating.
The result was violent, forced evictions. Company security forces, backed by local police, bulldozed villages, burned crops, shot livestock, and displaced over 1,700 families, leaving them completely destitute.
This is a nightmare. The local government is complicit, the local courts are corrupt, and protesting gets you beaten. So how do they throw the boomerang?
The displaced villagers formed a grassroots coalition called the Clean Sugar Campaign. They realized they couldn't fight the Cambodian government directly, so they aimed their pressure at the international supply chain that was funding the abuse. First, they partnered with international human rights groups to document the abuses and generate global media coverage, dubbing the product blood sugar.
Naming and shaming. But media coverage doesn't hurt a corporation's bottom line unless it triggers an economic mechanism.
Which is exactly what they did next. The activists threw the boomerang at the European Union. They lobbied the European Parliament relentlessly, presenting evidence that the sugar being imported tariff-free into Europe was produced through severe human rights violations. They demanded the EU suspend Cambodia's preferential trade access.
Incredible.
Simultaneously, they targeted the specific corporations involved. With the help of international lawyers, they actually filed civil lawsuits in the United Kingdom against Tate and Lyle, the massive British sugar refining company, accusing them of receiving illegally acquired goods.
They took the fight from the dirt roads of Cambodia to the high courts of London.
Yes, and they went after the money. They publicly exposed and filed complaints against massive financial institutions like the ANZ banking group and Deutsche Bank, who were providing the loans to the sugar plantations.
I see the boomerang curve now. The local people throw their grievance outward to international networks. Those networks amplify the message and hit the foreign corporations, the European regulators, and the global banks with legal and PR nightmares. And then the pressure boomerangs back onto the Cambodian government and the local elites. The forward investors say, fix this PR disaster and stop the abuses, or we are pulling our millions of dollars of investment. It forces the oppressive government to change its behavior from the outside in. That is incredibly strategic.
It is, but what's fascinating here is that the necessity of boomerang activism highlights a massive structural flaw in our global system, a concept scholars call transnational exclusion.
Explain that. Who is being excluded?
Everyday people are being excluded. The global economy is heavily regulated by massive, powerful organizations like the World Trade Organization or WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank. These institutions make highly technical decisions about tariffs, intellectual property, and structural economic adjustments. But they suffer from a massive democratic deficit.
Right. I don't get to vote for the head of the WTO. None of us do.
Exactly. These organizations are run by unelected bureaucrats and trade ministers, sitting in closed-door meetings in Geneva or Washington, D.C. Yet the decisions they make instantly and profoundly affect the livelihoods of a garment worker in Bangladesh, a factory worker in Detroit, or a sugar farmer in Cambodia.
Yeah.
Because these individuals have absolutely no formal democratic voice in the institutions that govern their economic survival, civil society and NGOs must step in. Activism isn't just a hobby. It is the only mechanism available to claim a voice for the marginalized in a system that explicitly excludes them.
Which brings us to the most devastating consequence of that exclusion, and perhaps the starkest failure of the entire global system: global poverty. Let's look at the numbers. Yes, globalization and free trade have created unprecedented wealth overall. The statistics show that the percentage of people living in extreme poverty has dropped over the last few decades. Yet we still have roughly 1 billion human beings living in chronic, debilitating poverty. Yeah. Despite all our technology and wealth, why is this so incredibly hard to fix? Why does the system keep generating poverty?
The sources outline a trifecta of systemic drivers that keep populations trapped in poverty. It is rarely just an accident of geography or bad luck. It is structural.
Okay, what's the first driver?
The first driver is the structural economic conditions imposed on developing nations by global financial institutions. We mentioned the IMF and the World Bank earlier. When a developing nation faces an economic crisis and needs a bailout loan, these institutions rarely hand over the money freely. They attach strict mechanisms called conditionalities.
Conditionalities. Essentially, we will give you the loan to save your economy, but only on the condition that you fundamentally restructure your society according to our ideology. What do those conditionalities look like in practice?
They usually mandate a rigid adherence to Western free market principles. The IMF operates on the logic that a state must balance its budget to ensure it can pay back the loan. To achieve this, they often force the borrowing government to drastically slash public spending on healthcare and education, remove subsidies on basic food staples, and aggressively privatize state-owned enterprises, including utilities like water and electricity.
Wait, I understand the cold accounting logic of balancing a budget, but think about the human mechanism of that. If you force a desperately poor country to privatize its municipal water supply and sell it to a foreign for-profit corporation, the corporation is going to raise the price of water to generate a profit for shareholders. Suddenly, the poorest citizens literally cannot afford to drink clean water. You've balanced the state's ledger, but you've condemned the population to disease and dehydration. It seems like the cure is worse than the disease.
And that is exactly the critique raised by many economists and humanitarian organizations. These structural adjustments prioritize the repayment of debt to Western banks over the survival and development of the local population.
Okay, what is the second driver?
The second major driver of poverty is war and political instability. Peace is the absolute prerequisite for economic development. When a country is engulfed in conflict, the state cannot function. It cannot build roads, educate children, or maintain hospitals.
The sources impartially point to the tragic, ongoing drain of the Syrian conflict, which began in 2011. Let's look at the mechanics of how war destroys an economy.
The Syrian civil war has caused the mass displacement of millions of internal and external refugees. When millions of your most productive citizens, teachers, engineers, farmers are forced to flee for their lives, human capital is drained. Infrastructure is reduced to rubble. Foreign investment drops to absolute zero. The state is fractured into competing warlord zones. A war-torn state simply cannot provide the basic public goods required to lift its population out of poverty. It can only focus on violent survival.
And the third driver. Assuming a developing country is at peace, and assuming it manages to navigate the IMF's conditionalities, why is it still trapped?
The third driver is the highly unequal paradigm of global trade. Developing countries are inherently disadvantaged in the global market. They often lack the sophisticated infrastructure, deep water ports, reliable electricity grids, paved highway systems required to export goods efficiently. Consequently, their economies are often relegated to exporting raw materials, unprocessed agricultural goods, or raw minerals.
Which are highly vulnerable to wild price fluctuations on the global market. But wait, wealthy Western nations are constantly preaching the gospel of free trade. They tell developing nations, just open your markets, export your goods, and the invisible hand will make you rich. Why doesn't that work?
Because the wealthy nations do not practice what they preach. While demanding that poor countries eliminate their tariffs and open their markets to Western goods, wealthy nations hypocritically maintain massive hidden trade barriers of their own. The most glaring example is agricultural subsidies. The United States and the European Union artificially subsidize their own domestic farmers with tens of billions of dollars every year.
Ah, I see the mechanism. If the U.S. government is paying an American corn farmer to grow corn, that American farmer can sell his corn on the global market at a price that is actually lower than the cost it took to produce it.
Exactly. And a poor farmer in West Africa who receives zero subsidies from his government simply cannot compete with that artificially depressed price. He goes bankrupt, he loses his farm, and he falls into extreme poverty. The free market is heavily rigged to protect domestic constituencies in the developed world.
And this invisible web of global economics connects directly to our dinner tables. The sources detail the global food crisis of 2008. How exactly did arcane financial instruments and global supply chains cause people in developing nations to literally riot in the streets over the price of a loaf of bread?
The 2008 food crisis is the ultimate demonstration of dangerous interconnectivity. It was triggered by a perfect storm of unrelated global events. First, there was a massive spike in global oil prices. Because modern industrial agriculture relies heavily on petroleum for fertilizer production and for transporting food across oceans, the cost to produce and move food skyrocketed.
Okay, that makes sense.
Simultaneously, the United States housing market collapsed due to the subprime mortgage crisis, triggering a global financial meltdown. Credit froze, investments collapsed, and speculators looking for a safe haven pulled their money out of the stock market and poured it into commodities, specifically agricultural futures like wheat and rice.
So Wall Street speculators, trying to hedge against the crashing housing market, started betting heavily on the price of food, artificially driving the price of basic dietary staples into the stratosphere.
Precisely. For a middle-class family in America or Europe, a 50% increase in the price of bread is annoying, but they can absorb it. But for a family in a developing nation who already spends 70% of their daily income just on basic calories, a price spike like that is a death sentence. They literally could not afford to eat.
The mechanism is terrifying. A banker in New York makes a reckless bet on a bundled mortgage in Florida. The bet fails, the market panics, and 6 months later, a mother in Egypt cannot afford flour to feed her children.
And that hunger immediately translated into political instability. Food riots broke out in over 40 countries. Desperate, starving citizens took to the streets, directly challenging the legitimacy of their governments and sometimes toppling them. It proved that localized hunger is no longer just an issue of a bad local harvest. It is a direct result of highly volatile, interconnected global supply chains.
The sources explore our relationship to this complex system through something they call subject positions, which is a really insightful way to analyze our own hypocrisy. We all wear different hats, and those hats have conflicting demands.
They absolutely do.
Think about it. As a consumer, when you walk into a giant supermarket, what do you want? You want a massive variety of produce available 365 days a year, and you want it to be as cheap as possible. You want a 99-cent avocado in the dead of winter.
Right.
But when you put on your hat as a citizen of your country, your demands change entirely. You want the local farmers in your state to be protected from cheap foreign competition so they can earn a living wage. And as a moral human being, you want to ensure that the 99-cent avocado wasn't harvested by exploited workers or produced by clearing a rainforest.
Exactly. And those distinct desires, the demand for insanely cheap consumer goods versus the desire for ethical production and domestic protection, are in direct, irreconcilable conflict. Politicians are constantly trying to walk a tightrope, passing international trade policies that satisfy you as a consumer at the checkout aisle while placating your outrage as a citizen. It creates a deeply schizophrenic global trade system.
Which fundamentally changes how we must view global poverty. We cannot just look at poverty as an unfortunate passive accident of geography that we observe from afar.
If we connect this to the deepest philosophical questions of international relations, poverty is not just an economic issue. It is a profound problem of global justice. The text highlights a famous ethical debate that frames this perfectly.
Let's hear it.
The philosopher Peter Singer proposes a thought experiment known as the rescue case. He argues that if you are walking to work in your expensive new shoes and you pass a shallow pond and see a toddler drowning in the water, you have an absolute moral obligation to wade into the mud and save the child, even if it ruins your shoes and makes you late for work.
Because the cost to you a ruined pair of shoes is trivial compared to the value of the human life saved. Any decent person would save the child.
Exactly. Singer extrapolates this to global poverty. He argues that citizens of wealthy nations are walking past the pond every single day. Because we have vast surplus wealth, we could easily save millions of lives in the developing world through foreign aid and charity at a very minimal cost to our own luxurious lifestyles. Therefore, we have a moral duty to help simply because we have the capacity to do so.
That makes intuitive sense. It's the core logic of most humanitarian charity. We have excess, they are starving, so we must give. But there is a counter-argument to this in the sources, right?
Yes. Other scholars, most notably Thomas Pogge, argue that Singer's analogy is fundamentally flawed because it ignores the structural reality of how the world actually works.
How so?
Pogge argues that wealthy nations and corporations are not just innocent bystanders coincidentally walking past a pond where a child happens to be drowning. When we look at the mechanisms we just discussed, the rigged trade rules, the crushing IMF conditionalities, the extraction of resources, Pogge argues that the wealthy nations are deeply implicated in maintaining the exact economic architecture that causes the poverty in the first place.
Oh, wow. So Pog is saying we didn't just walk past the pond, we actively built the pond, we filled it with water, and we pushed the child in so we could harvest cheaper avocados.
That is the brutal implication. Podge argues that our moral obligation isn't just about giving charity to alleviate suffering. It is a negative duty to stop actively harming the global poor by propping up an unjust international system that benefits us at their expense.
That completely flips the moral calculus.
Yeah.
It means the solution to global poverty isn't just sending a check to a charity once a year. It requires fundamentally dismantling and reforming the economic architecture of the 195 sovereign states we rely on.
Yes.
And that realization leads us directly to the final and perhaps most urgent section of our deep dive: transnational threats. We keep coming back to the fundamental architecture of the Westphalian system: borders, sovereignty, the golden rule that no state can interfere in the internal affairs of another.
The bedrock of the system.
But what happens when a threat doesn't care about borders? What happens when the danger isn't an invading army, but an internal genocide or a collapsing ecosystem? This is where the 400-year-old operating system faces its greatest stress test. Let's look at protecting people first. Since Westphalia, sovereignty was an absolute shield. A dictator could do whatever he wanted to his own people inside his own borders. How did that begin to change?
The absolute shield of sovereignty began to crack under the unbearable weight of the atrocities of the late 20th century. Following the end of the Cold War, the world witnessed horrific events where states turned on their own populations, specifically the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans during the breakup of Yugoslavia and the devastating 1994 genocide in Rwanda, where roughly 800,000 Tutsis were slaughtered in 100 days, while the international community largely stood by and watched.
The guilt and shock of those failures forced a reckoning in international law. The world realized that hiding behind state sovereignty while the government butchers its own citizens is morally bankrupt.
Exactly. This led to a radical conceptual shift in international relations formalized at the UN in 2005, known as the Responsibility to Protect, or R2P.
R2P, what does it actually do?
R2P fundamentally redefines sovereignty. It argues that sovereignty is not just a right to control a territory, it is a conditional responsibility. Every state has a primary responsibility to protect its population from 4 specific mass atrocity crimes: genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity.
And here is the radical part. If a state manifestly fails to protect its populations from those crimes, or worse, if the state is the one actively committing the slaughter, the shield of sovereignty is pierced. The responsibility to protect that population falls to the international community.
Correct. R2P dictates that the international community must first use peaceful means, diplomacy, humanitarian aid, economic sanctions to halt the atrocities. But if peaceful measures fail, the doctrine authorizes the international community, through the UN Security Council, to use collective military force as a last resort to save civilian lives.
It's a beautiful, powerful concept on paper. But we have to impartially analyze the mechanics of how this actually plays out in reality.
Okay.
Because the sources note that the application of R2P has been tragically limited and highly inconsistent. What are the limits?
The limits are defined by cold, hard geopolitics. First, there is the issue of capacity. The international community has finite military and financial resources. Launching a complex military intervention in a foreign country, suppressing a host nation's military, and then attempting to rebuild a shattered society is incredibly dangerous and costly. Western democracies have little domestic appetite to send their soldiers to die in conflicts where their own national security isn't directly threatened.
Right. The whole, why should our young men and women die to police a civil war halfway across the globe?
Exactly. But the second, much larger hurdle is political will, which brings us right back to the UN Security Council veto mechanism.
Oh, right.
R2P requires authorization from the Security Council. If a regime is slaughtering its people, but that regime happens to be a vital geopolitical ally of one of the P5 nations, the veto will be used to block any intervention.
The sources point to the ongoing tragedy in Syria as the starkest example. Yeah.
Yes. The Syrian government has used chemical weapons and indiscriminate bombing against its own civilian population. But because the Syrian regime is a crucial strategic ally of Russia, Russia has repeatedly used its veto power to block the UN Security Council from authorizing robust R2P measures or referring the leadership to the International Criminal Court.
So the grim reality is that in the anarchic system, the geopolitical interests of powerful states almost always trump humanitarian principles. Sovereignty is pierced only when it is politically convenient for the heavyweights.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Which brings us to the ultimate transnational threat, the one that truly respects no borders, no vetoes, and no treaties: the environment. Because climate change is the ultimate collective action problem. A ton of carbon emitted from a coal plant in Beijing, a factory in Germany, or an SUV in New York all end up in the exact same shared atmosphere, warming the globe equally. How does international relations even begin to categorize and solve a problem that big?
To understand the environmental crisis through the lens of IR, we have to look at common pool resource theory. We need to categorize the goods in the world based on two specific questions. Can you exclude someone from using the good? And does your use of the good deplete it, leaving less for others?
Okay, let's break down this matrix. What is the first category?
First, we have private goods. Think of a car or an apple. They are highly excludable. I have the keys to the car. You cannot drive it unless I let you. You have to buy the apple to eat it. And they are rivalrous, meaning my consumption depletes the resource. If I eat the apple, you cannot eat that exact same apple. Private goods are easily managed by traditional markets.
Okay, private goods make sense. What's the opposite?
The opposite are public goods. Think of national defense or the light from a lighthouse or basic knowledge. They are non-excludable if the lighthouse is shining to prevent ships from crashing. I cannot stop your ship from seeing the light. And they are non-rivalrous. Your ship seeing the light does not diminish the amount of light available for my ship to see.
Okay, so private goods are excludable and rivalrous. Public goods are non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Where does the environment fit in?
The environment falls into a highly problematic third category, common pool resources or common goods. Think of a global fishery in the open ocean or a vast forest or the Earth's atmosphere.
Oh.
They are non-excludable. It is virtually impossible to stop anyone from sailing a boat into the open ocean or from breathing the air or from cutting down a tree in an unpatrolled jungle. But crucially, they are rivalrous.
Meaning they can be depleted. Every single tuna that your massive factory ship scoops out of the open ocean is a tuna that my local fishing boat cannot catch. Every ton of carbon your factory pumps into the shared atmosphere degrades the quality of the climate for everyone else.
Exactly. And this dangerous combination, open access but finite supply, leads to a famous concept developed by Garrett Hardin in 1968, known as the tragedy of the commons.
The tragedy of the commons. Explain the mechanism of how this tragedy unfolds.
Hardin used a simple hypothetical. Imagine a pasture, a commons that is open to all local herdsmen to graze their cattle. Because human beings are rational, self-interested actors, every individual herdsman will calculate that it is in his best economic interest to add one more cow to his herd. He receives 100% of the profit from selling that extra cow, but the negative impact, the slight overgrazing of the shared pasture, is fractionally distributed among all the herdsmen.
So the math tells him,
Oh.
always add another cow.
Right. But because every single herdsman is making that exact same rational, selfish calculation, they all endlessly add cows until the pasture is completely stripped bare, the ecosystem collapses, all the cows die, and everyone starves. Hardin argued that unless a resource is strictly privatized or tightly regulated by a coercive central authority like a strong state, humans are tragically doomed to destroy their shared environments through selfish logic.
And when you scale that up to 195 sovereign states sharing one atmosphere, it feels incredibly bleak. It implies we are mathematically doomed to burn the planet because no state wants to be the sucker who stops polluting while their rivals keep growing their economies. But the sources highlight a glimmer of hope, a counter-theory offered by Elinor Ostrom, who actually won a Nobel Prize in economics for her work. What did Ostrom discover that Hardin missed?
Ostrom challenged the pessimistic assumption that humans are just greedy, robotic algorithms incapable of cooperation. Through extensive empirical research of actual communities around the world, from Swiss alpine farmers managing shared pastures, to Japanese villagers managing communal forests, to irrigation systems in Nepal, she proved that the tragedy is not inevitable. Ostrom demonstrated that under the right conditions, human communities possess the capacity to self-organize. They do not need to privatize the land, and they do not need a coercive dictator to force them to behave. They can organically build complex, shared systems of social regulation. They create mutual agreements, monitor each other's behavior, establish graduated sanctions for rule breakers, and successfully govern scarcity to ensure the resource survives for generations.
So Ostrom proves that human beings actually have the capacity for incredibly sophisticated collective ecological management. But here's the massive question for international relations. Ostrom studied local communities where people actually know each other and share a culture. Can we take that localized mechanism of self-organization and scale it up to govern the entire planet? Because the Earth's atmosphere is the ultimate common tool resource, and we don't have a world government to act as the coercive authority.
That is the existential challenge of our time. And the international community has spent the last 50 years desperately trying to build that global self-organization through a series of environmental mega conferences.
Where did that start?
We can trace this diplomatic effort back to the 1972 UN Stockholm Conference, which was revolutionary because it was the first time states formally acknowledged the link between economic development and environmental degradation. It led to the creation of the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP.
And the momentum continued in 1987 with the Brundtland Report, which coined a term we hear everywhere today, sustainable development. The profound idea that humanity must find a way to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs.
Exactly. That led to the massive 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, which was notable because it opened the doors to civil society. Thousands of NGOs participated alongside state leaders, proving that the environment cannot be managed by states alone.
Right.
And all of this arduous, grinding diplomacy eventually culminated in the 2015 Paris Agreement.
The Paris Agreement is a milestone because of the consensus it achieved. For the first time, nearly every nation on Earth, including the massive historical polluters like the U.S. and the rapidly developing economic giants like China and India, agreed to a shared global framework. They committed to specific, nationally determined strategies to fundamentally restructure their economies, to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels.
It was a monumental diplomatic achievement. But returning to our paradox of anarchy and international law, the commitments made in Paris are largely voluntary and self-reported. There is no global environmental police force to arrest a country if it misses its carbon reduction targets.
Which brings up the ultimate debate analyzed in the sources. Given the ticking clock of climate change, do we need to invent a new mechanism? Do we need a global environmental organization? Essentially, a WTO for the environment with actual teeth, the legal power to impose crushing economic sanctions on sovereign states that failed to meet their ecological obligations.
It is a fierce debate. Some scholars argue that it is absolutely necessary. They point out that the current UN Environment Program is chronically underfunded, structurally weak, and lacks any coercive power. They argue that without a centralized authority with teeth, states will inevitably succumb to the tragedy of the commons, prioritizing short-term economic growth over long-term survival.
But I imagine the counterargument is deeply rooted in everything we've discussed about Westphalia and sovereignty.
Exactly. The counterargument is that establishing a global environmental organization with true coercive power is practically impossible. Powerful, heavily industrialized states, the US, China, Russia, will never willingly sign a treaty that surrenders their core economic sovereignty to a group of international bureaucrats. They will not allow an outside organization to dictate their domestic energy policies or penalize their industries.
Which brings us to an incredibly profound realization that essentially summarizes this entire deep dive. It highlights the ultimate paradox of modern international relations.
It does. It is the core friction of our era. We are currently trying to solve existential, borderless threats. Climate change, the collapse of global fisheries, unregulated artificial intelligence, devastating global pandemics. These phenomena do not recognize passports. They do not stop at customs checkpoints.
Nope, they don't.
Yet we are trying to solve these 21st century borderless crises using a legal and political operating system that was designed in 1648 for one highly specific purpose: to protect borders, separate people, and prioritize competing national self-interests above all else.
It is exactly like trying to run the most advanced, complex 21st century software on a clunky, 400-year-old hardware system. The machine simply wasn't built to process the data, and it is freezing up under the strain.
That is a perfect metaphor for the current state of global politics.
Well, let's pull back and wrap up this incredible journey. We have covered a massive amount of ground today, dismantling the hallucination of the map.
We really have.
We started in the chaotic, overlapping jurisdictions of medieval Europe, where popes and princes fought for control, leading to the unimaginable slaughter of the 30 Years' War. We saw how the exhausted survivors invented the sovereign state at Westphalia to establish borders, and how the French Revolution injected that bureaucratic shell with the fiery soul of the nation. And we confronted the dark irony of how this specific European model was violently forced onto the rest of the globe through colonialism, leaving newly independent peoples no choice but to adopt the very system of their oppressors.
A dark history for sure.
Yeah. We explored the mechanics of survival in this anarchic, world police-free zone. We looked at how Renaissance city-states invented diplomacy to keep trade flowing, and how Kennedy and Khrushchev bypassed public posturing during the Cuban Missile Crisis to walk humanity back from the brink of nuclear annihilation. We saw the profound human endurance required to forge the Iranian nuclear deal, proving that diplomacy isn't about trust, it's about verifiable mechanics.
And we decoded the invisible rules of international law.
We learned how customary law emerges from the sheer exhaustion of conflict, how jus cogens acts as the universal cheat code against atrocities, and the brutal realist logic behind the UN Security Council veto. We analyzed the immense costs and deep global resentments generated by the U.S. acting as the global security manager, and how supranational experiments like the EU attempt to pool sovereignty.
But we didn't just stay in the halls of power, either.
Right. We looked at the voices from below. We unpacked Polanyi's double movement, showing how society naturally rebels against ruthless market expansion, and how modern competition states often abandon their citizens to appease global corporations. We explored the brilliant mechanics of boomerang activism, watching marginalized Cambodian farmers bypass their corrupt local government to strike at the international supply chains exploiting them.
That was a powerful example.
And we confronted the stark, structural drivers of global poverty. We saw how IMF conditionalities, the devastation of war, and hypocritical agricultural subsidies trap billions in despair. We analyzed how an obscure subprime mortgage crisis in the U.S. could cause a family in Egypt to starve, forcing us to reckon with Thomas Paquet's chilling assertion. Wealthy nations aren't just ignoring the drowning child. We built the pond.
A heavy thought to carry.
Finally, we looked at the existential stress tests of our time. We saw the fragile hope of the responsibility to protect, often shattered by geopolitical virus. And we explored the desperate global effort to avoid the tragedy of the commons, scaling up Elinor Ostrom's theories of collective management to save our shared atmosphere through the Paris Agreement, despite the lack of a global environmental enforcer.
It's been quite the journey.
It has been a truly massive deep dive. We hope we have thoroughly dismantled that 195-piece puzzle for you, giving you an entirely new mechanical lens through which to view tomorrow's news cycle. You aren't just watching random events anymore. You are watching the gears of a very old machine turning.
Once you see the gears, you can't unsee them.
Exactly. But before we sign off, we want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over on your own.
Okay, lay it on us.
The sources make it abundantly clear that our global system of fiercely independent sovereign nation-states is not an objective law of physics. It is not the natural predetermined state of human existence. It is a human-made construct born out of European trauma in the 17th century and spread globally through force.
True.
So, as we face a future defined by terrifying borderless threats that simply do not care about the imaginary lines we drew on a map 400 years ago, we have to ask ourselves a very dangerous question. Is the nation-state actually equipped to save us? Or is our desperate clinging to this 400-year-old operating system the very thing holding humanity back from survival?
That is the question of the century.
The next time you look at a map of the world, ask yourself, is this the architecture of our future or a beautifully colored relic of our past? Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We will see you next time.